How do you map heaven? What's the route that takes you down to hell? When does your time run out? And where are you going to go next? Map makers throughout history have not just plotted this world, but the next. I'm Jerry Brotton, a map historian. Welcome to What's Your Map? An Oculi Mundi Exploration. In this series, we speak to people who live, love and work with maps, making, preserving, interpreting and being inspired by them. In each episode, we ask our guests to unfold a map that is special to them and tell us the story behind it. To follow the map as we talk about it on this podcast, go to oculi-mundi.com. Barack Obama is a fan, and so are his goats. When he isn't busy herding his flock on his farm outside New Delhi, William Dalrymple is one of the UK's most important historians. His best-selling books have won every award going, including the Wolfson Prize-winning White Moguls, The Return of a King, The Last Mogul, and The Anarchy. He co-founded the Jaipur Literature Festival and the chart-topping podcast Empire with Anita Anand. His new book is The Golden Road, How Ancient India Transformed the World, and features on its cover a map of the kind that we're going to be talking about today. So thank you, Willie, for joining me on What's Your Map? And what is the map that you've brought us to look at today?
I am obsessed by Jain maps, there's a whole world of them, which I think, unless you are particularly interested in sort of tantric esoterica, people are generally completely unaware. And one of the nice things of putting this map on the cover of the book is that hopefully it'll bring it to people's attention. Nice.
And we have it here. So the Sunderland Collection has an example of these so-called Jain maps. And as you're saying, they're very esoteric, they're very spiritual, they're a religious map of the Jain world picture. Now, to a Western eye, and I guess we're both to some extent Westerners, but we work in different traditions, you particularly in terms of Indian history and culture. But to a Western eye, this is completely alien as a map. So just walk us into it. What are we looking at when we see this map?
Well, I wouldn't entirely agree that it's entirely alien, in that it is clearly a map, and it's a circular map. So it's not a million miles away from the Mappa Mundi or
Which
that.
is true, yeah. So that we think about medieval Christian maps, and actually they're not about getting from A to B, but they show you a theology. They're a spiritual world picture. And this is a map which we can... It's a beautiful map, though. God, Willie, it's absolutely beautiful, with these concentric circles showing oceans, but then also showing fish and turtles, and a centre of the world, which is Mount Meru.
The Jain conquerors, all the different areas.
So just start to pinpoint some elements of the map. Let's look at it from the centre. So in the centre of the map, what do we have? We have Mount Meru.
So we should perhaps go back a tiny bit and explain that the Jain faith, which this is an expression of its cosmology, has a whole series of teachings which are completely unique to it. And the more you look at it, it's very, very heavily distinct from both Hinduism and Buddhism, with which it's often compared.
And you're writing about this in Golden Roads. Give us a kind of historical sketch here, because we're talking about Jainism emerging prior to Buddhism.
It's a much debated matter, but what you can certainly say is that both Jainism and Buddhism are the product of the same sort of great churning that mankind underwent at the beginning of the Neolithic Revolution. Man is settling down, you're having the first towns, you're having the first merchant class, you're also having farmers distinct from urban peoples. The plough has arrived in India at this time, so there's enough agricultural produce to support large urban groups. And the presence of large number of people gathered in what are now often in India large towns by 500 BC, which is the period we're talking about, changes everything about human life and human society. And you find at the same time as Mahavira, who is the main founder, historical founder of the Jain faith, who lived around 500 BC, he's probably one or two generations ahead of the Buddha. And the Buddha a lot of scholars, particularly Richard Gombrich, posits that the Buddha is reacting more against Jainism than he is against Hinduism. The Jains have a completely distinct idea of karma, for example. In Hinduism and in Buddhism, karma are good actions that you accumulate and which help you escape the cycle of rebirth. So it's a positive thing. Jains view karma as almost a physical substance that attaches itself to the soul and weighs it down. And you have to take very extreme measures in the Jain faith to get rid of this polluting substance. And of all the faiths of India, the Jains are the most extreme in their asceticism, both then and today. Buddhist monks shave their heads. Jain monks pluck their hair out. Buddhist monks are allowed most vegetarian foodstuffs. Jains are very particular. You can't have any garlic, any onion, or any root vegetables. When you walk, as Jain ascetics do, across the landscape, you have to have a cover over your mouth to stop you imbibing insects and destroying life in that way, and hold a brush in your hand to brush aside any ants you may step on. So it's the most eco-friendly and sort of in tune with nature faith that has ever been. But it's also a faith that punishes the body more severely than any other. And one of the best ways, surest ways in Jain cosmology to escape, to cleanse your soul and escape the cycle of rebirth is to starve yourself to death. This is salikana. I've met people that have done this and will happily talk about that later. But in order to do this, you undergo this very rigorous life whereby you cannot beg. You have to wait for people to give food to you. You certainly can't, even a lay Jain is not allowed to be a farmer because you might plough a worm in half, and that would add to your karmic pollution. So it's difficult to be a Jain in this world, and the only things you're really allowed to do is become a banker or a merchant. So the Jains, ironically, for people that are extreme ascetics and the faith that promotes the most extremism, are also incredibly rich bankers and some of the richest bankers in India and merchant classes today.
And yet is a very small minority of the population.
Tiny minority.
Yeah.
And the Buddha, very much when he's seeking the middle path, not indulgence, but not extreme asceticism. The extreme asceticism that he's setting himself against is the Jains. And he's saying you don't have to do what they do. You don't have to starve yourself. You don't have to kill yourself. But nor should you wallow in sensual indulgence and go to fancy restaurants and visit bordellos and have lots of wild parties.
So is this why we have so many of the surviving Jain maps? Is that rigidity of that spiritual cosmology, because this is an image of the cosmos, of the universe according to Jains. Is this why we have these very elaborate maps, because of that need to be so clear and precise about their world picture?
My view about Jain maps, and this is a personal view, not orthodoxy, is that they're not only a visual expression of the world in Jain, as understood by pious Jains. In other words, they're not just a map of the world. They're also heavily influenced by mandalas, which are maps of power, and not completely unlike, the kind of pentagram that a sorcerer might make his spells within. It's a shape that's magical and enhances power, and in the sense of being an aid to meditation is something that you have on a wall as a focus for your thoughts. So in the Buddhist and Jain tradition, meditation, and in Hinduism, meditation is very important. But in the Buddhist and Jain traditions, you often meditate on mandalas as a way of focusing your thoughts. So what you're looking at is an expression of your faith, which is a highly intricate and beautiful object. So you can imagine Jain ascetics settling down in front of one of these maps and absorbing themselves in a whole world that can draw them in and remind them of why they're undergoing their privations, the ascetic life they've chosen. And often, Jain maps, the one we're looking at here from this particular collection is the classic central portion of a Jain map, with Mount Meru in the centre and the concentric circles.
So what is Mount? So Mount Meru is there in the centre of the map. So around this you have these concentric circles. So we are seeing like a cross-section, aren't we, of the Jain cosmology. So we have to imagine...
But you're seeing only the central section.
Yeah.
So when you're sitting in meditation in front of this, not only do you have an image of the universe as conceived by your faith, you're also having the rewards which are promised to you if you manage to get rid of your karmic hindrance and rise up into the world of the gods and the world of the immortals. The gods, incidentally, are not gods as understood elsewhere, because they're also part of the cycle. And after a certain period, after their good deeds have worn off, they sink down. Likewise, if you are in hell and you're undergone a period of punishment, that is again for a period of punishment, after which you rise. So the Jains view human existence and these cycles of rebirth as part of an enormous circular motion of which both humans and the gods are part.
So this is a representation of the terrestrial world, but also the spiritual world, because it's showing at the centre, it shows Mount Meru, but it also shows India, down here, but then it also shows across these concentric circles of both oceans, it shows fish, but then it shows figures who are morphing into animals and back again. So
it's the whole dynamic of human existence displayed, a human and godly existence, and animal. I mean, animals, gods, and humans are different stages in this journey. And
there are tortoises in this outer concentric ocean, which I think they're just absolutely beautiful.
Even Mahavira, the greatest of all the Jains in the Jain faith, was at different times a lion and I think an ant or something in the various stories of his earlier lives. And so this central map that we have can be imagined as part of a much larger structure of the cosmic body, with the head at the top, feet at the bottom, the gods at the chest, the hell worlds in the nether regions and the legs, and the section that we're looking at is effectively the tummy, the center of the torso,
a very tiny tummy,
and Mount Meru is, if you like, the belly button of the world.
Which is, and really, because the Greeks have a similar idea of the omphalos, of Delphi. So it's interesting. Yeah, so you have a similar idea going on about that's the navel of the world.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so it is interesting, as you were saying earlier, about the connection to Christian medieval topographies of those Mappa Mundi, which are also very much about embodiment. They're about images of Christ. And at the centre here... But
looking back further, I mean, it's very interesting, this thing you say about the Greeks. I didn't know that. And remember that all the Indic faiths, like Sanskrit, are connected to the Western faiths. And so you get within the Sanskritic world, which includes the Jains and the Avestas of Iran, there are echoes of this in classical Greek and Roman mythology. So the supreme deity in some of the Vedas is Deus Pitta, which is the same as Jupiter. And the Deus part of it is the same word as Deus in Latin, which is God. So these are all different manifestations of an Indo-European world where there are both linguistic and theological similarities. So while we're looking at something that initially appears to be very, very different from anything in the West, there are many commonalities.
Is very similar. Well, with that then, if we talk about those commonalities, I like to talk about the idea that all pre-modern cultures do what we call, or I call, egocentric mapping. You put yourself at the centre. So what is it about Mount Meru? What's the significance of it within Jain thinking as a space, as a terrestrial place?
So this is somewhere where our understandings differ, I think, a little, Jerry. You've written about Jain maps, and you'd say that it's a representation of the Pamirs. I had always understood it's very specifically a representation of Mount Kailash, which is this extraordinary mountain in western Tibet.
Where you've been, I'm sure.
Where I actually haven't been yet.
Let's go. Can we go?
I've been to most of the other sacred mountains in that region.
We could do a podcast about it.
It would be a great trip. Many people I know in India have gone. There's two ways. You can go by Bhutan, you can go by Nepal. And it's a very, very arduous trek.
And so why is it so important for Jain beliefs?
If you look at the ancestry, it was probably sacred pre-Buddhism, pre-Jainism, pre-Hinduism for the Bon faith, which is the oldest faith of the Tibetan plateau. And to this day, you find the last remaining Bon nomads circling Kailash along with Buddhist pilgrims, some of the Buddhists on their hands and knees, some crawling, some of them rolling around Mount Kailash. And Mount Kailash, in all the faiths, is the center of the world. So my understanding is that Mount Meru is the spiritual equivalent in the higher worlds of Mount Meru, the actual center of cosmology in all three of the great South Indian faiths, in Jainism, Hinduism, and Buddhism.
And then it spirals outwards and you have India shown. So India is Bharat, is that correct? And that space is Jambudvipa?
So Bharat, which is India, where the descendants of King Bharata live. Yeah. We've just glossed over this idea of Jambudvipa. So Rose Apple Island is the central continent of Indic cosmologies, of which Bharata is the southernmost. So it's arranged like petals on a lotus.
Yeah.
And Bharat is the southernmost petal. Where the Aryas live. And the Aryas it's the same root as Aryans, but they are the higher beings. In other words, where civilized men live.
And the barbarians are in the north.
And the Malekka, who are the barbarians, are in the north.
Like me, the northerners.
You are definitely a northern barbarian by any reading, Jerry Brotton.
That's why I say goats like I say goats. Okay, back to the barbarians.
As someone who grew up far to the north even of you, I will look on you as a Midlander almost.
No, Will, because you went to Ampleforth does not mean you're a Yorkshireman like me. You're not having that.
I'm born in Edinburgh and grew up in the Lothians. So,
can we get back to Mount Meru, please?
I'm sorry, Jerry. Yorkshire's south to me. You were not using this map to get around. Yeah. You're not saying this is which is the way to Mount Meru, and off you go through Nepal. This is an aid to meditation and understanding, and if you combine this with the rest of the cosmic body of which this is a part, you have, as part of your meditation, the consequences of your actions and the necessity of considering all your actions before you take them, and the fact that you can go badly wrong and end up in hell worlds.
But you have jinns, don't you? So on this map, you
jinnas. Jinnas are different from the jinns. Jinns in the Islamic world are spirits.
Absolutely.
The jinnas are conquerors.
And the jinnas would be on these four corners of outside time and space, because it's an interesting point that you make that in the Jain world, there's a space beyond time and space.
Correct.
And you have that in Christian medieval maps. The idea is to get beyond this world. It's just the same in the Hereford Mappa Mundi. It's about getting to Christ above. It's getting into heaven or hell.
And in the case, and what's interesting in the distinction with Jainism is that while there are gods in Jainism, they are not immortal. Yeah. They're part of the same cycle. But the jinas are those who've escaped the cycle and shown the way across the precipice of...
they're known as ford makers. Is that true? There's a phrase used that they're called exactly, ford makers. Yeah. Right. So they're sort of spiritual enablers.
So yes, the jina means liberator or spiritual conqueror. Yeah. And the jinas, or tirthankras, which is the word for ford maker, are a series of 24 human teachers who each, in Jain myth, discovered how to escape the eternal cycle of death and rebirth. So they're a ford maker over the rivers of rebirth. You're fording the rivers of rebirth and escaping them, which is why they're shown beyond the map, outside existence. But what's important to realize is that they're not gods who you can appeal to. So there's no point praying to Mahavir because he's not there.
Right.
And that's one of the great differences in Jain art, is that in Hindu art, when you see an idol, even if it's a meditating idol, say Lord Shiva in a meditative position, you can pray to Lord Shiva, and the Hindu will believe that he can have darshan, he can meet the eyes of the god, and like a Christian can pray and have an experience of the god in a sacred place and dedicate his prayers to the god and hope for action by the god to help him. With the jinas, you're looking at those who have taught the way, but they're not there anymore to help you. So you can say as many prayers in front of the statue, and it's not going to do you any good. It might help you lose some of your bad karma just by the spiritual exercises of it. But the images in Jain temples are dead images, because in the sense they're not filled with the presence of a god in the way that a Hindu image is.
But these maps would be shown in the temples, is that right? Because they're quite big. This is a 2 metre by 1.5 metre. It's on cloth and it's painted in distemper.
And some of them are actually murals frescoed onto the walls.
You were touching on this in terms of the power of the asceticism of Jainism and saying about how powerful it is even today for followers of the faith. So there's a sense in which these are still dead images in terms of how people engage with them, as you were saying, but also the beliefs in them are very powerful and meaningful for people. I mean, you were talking about how people will actually kill themselves in terms of that belief.
So when I was writing a book called 9 Lives, I went down to Sravanabellagola, which is one of the main centres of Jain pilgrimage. It lies only about 3 or 4 hours out of what's now the tech centre, Bangalore. And you fly to the very snazzy new Bangalore airport, which is as fancy as any airport anywhere in Europe or America, rather fancier than any airport in America. And you drive for 3 hours and you get to this beautiful, beautiful... can I just read a description of arriving in Sravanabellagola in the morning? 2 hills of blackly gleaming granite, smooth as glass, rise from a thickly wooded landscape of banana plantations and jagged palmyra palms. It is dawn. Below lies the ancient pilgrimage town of Sravanabellagola, where the crumbling walls of monasteries, temples and dharmasalas cluster around a grid of dusty red earth roads. The roads converge on a great circular tank. The tank is dotted with the spreading leaves and still-clothed buds of floating lotus flowers. Already, despite the early hours, the first pilgrims are gathering here. For more than 2,000 years, this Karnataka town has been sacred to the Jains. It was here, in the 3rd century BC, that the first emperor of India, Chandragupta Maurya, embraced the Jain religion and died through a self-imposed fast to the death. The emperor's chosen atonement for the killings for which he'd been responsible in his political life of conquest. 1,200 years later, in 981, a Jain general commissioned the largest monolithic statue in India, 60 feet high, at the top of the larger of the 2 hills. This is an image of the royal hero Bahubali, and he stood in meditation so long that vines and creepers started to wind their ways around the legs. And in the statue, you can see these vines still staying there. And the whole Jain calendar revolves around a couple of times every 20 years, I think, when Jains gather, erect an enormous canopy over this vast statue with lots of scaffolding and all around, and pour milk, honey and ghee in great currents over it. And a lot of Jain ascetics don't wear clothes. They're what's called sky-clad. When you go there, you see all these naked men, absolutely butt naked, wandering around. And while I was there, I met this extraordinary woman. So this Jain nun, as we walked the hill, told me her story, and she said how she'd made up her mind that she would take Diksha, which is to become an ascetic. And she said, that November they plucked my hair for the first time. It's the first step, like a test of your commitments, because if you can't take the pain of having your hair plucked out, you're not going to be ready to take the next step. That day I performed a fast, and that evening one of the senior Matajis of the Sangha, that's the monastic community, applied the ash of dried cow dung. This acts as sort of a natural antiseptic if you bleed. I had very beautiful long hair, she said. And as I was still very young, my guru wanted to cut it with scissors, then shave my hair with a razor, so as not to inflict such pain on me. But I insisted and said there was no going back now. I was very obstinate. Whatever I wanted to do, I did, so they agreed to do what I wished. I think everyone was rather amazed by my stubbornness and my determination. And then she told the story of how, at the same time that she was taking Diksha, there was another girl who was taking Diksha from a family she didn't know, and they were both brought together to this place to take the Diksha together. And they became a pair. because in the Jain faith, it's not considered safe for one woman to wander alone, so she should have a companion. And these two lived together. And she told me the story of how basically they had not become lovers in a physical sense, but had become so close that they lived together, slept together, ate together, walked together for month after month. And then her friend got some terrible illness and began to fade away. And after several years, when it was clear that she wasn't going to get better, her friend had decided to take the ritual fast. And I met her just after her friend had died, and she was about to undertake the fast itself. And I'll just read you her description, which I find very, very moving, of her friend's death. Just after 1:30, I went to take my food and was about to start eating when my friend Pragamati cried out loudly. I rushed to look after her. It was clear her condition was not good at all. There was no one around except a boy at the gate, so I sent him off for the doctor. When I came back, I held her hand, and she whispered that now she wished to stop all remaining food. They give up one foodstuff after another, so they give up first dal, then they give up milk, then they give up whatever else they're eating, and finally they give up milk. Her suffering was too much for her now. She said that for her, death was as welcome as life, and that there was a time to live and a time to die. Now, she said, the time has come for me to be liberated from my body. By that time, our Guruji had returned, and he gathered the community. By early afternoon, all the Gurus and Matajis were there guiding her and sitting around the bed. Others came to touch her feet. The room was full of people, and so was the veranda outside. Everyone was chanting the Namakara mantra, singing bhajans and kirtans, and reading the Jain texts which explain the nature of the soul. Everyone was there to support Pragamati, to give her courage as she began to slip away. So you can imagine they're sitting under one of these maps, embracing
a map like this, and that would have had that immediate impact. I mean, this is a map that really goes back.
Shows where she's off to. It's a map of where she's going next. It's where the soul is heading. So around 4 p.m., the doctor said he thought she was about to die, but she held on till 9. It was very peaceful in the end. It was dark then, and the lamps were lit all around the room. Her breathing had been very difficult that day, but towards the end it became easier. I held her hand, the monks chanted, and her eyes closed. For a while I didn't even know she had gone. She just slipped away. When I realized she had left, I wept bitterly. We are not supposed to do this, and our Guruji frowned at me. But I couldn't help myself. I'd followed all the steps correctly until she passed away, but then everything I bottled up came pouring out. Her body was still there, but she wasn't in it. It was no longer her. The next day, the 15th of December, she was cremated. They burned her at 4 p.m. All the devotees and indoor came, over 2,000 people. It was a Sunday. The following morning at dawn, I got up and headed off. There was no reason to stay. It was the first time, as a nun, that I had ever walked anywhere alone.
It's very beautiful. It also, isn't it extraordinary? I've connected maps to lots of things, but not grief like that.
This was, for her at this point, would have represented where her friend was going next. Was she going up to the top of the body to enjoy the Elysian plains of the Jain faith, the reward, or would she go down?
And there would be no notion of where she would be going.
Well, if she had committed Salakana, she would have the best possible chance of escaping completely and becoming effectively a Jina herself, escaping to the boundaries of the map, beyond the oceans, to cross, like the Ford makers before her, to escape the cycles of rebirth, escape the oceans of rebirth, and to liberate herself.
Where do you sit now as somebody who's British, who lives pretty much full-time in India, has written this book, which is effectively recast the early history of India? All the books have been doing, the last few books have been doing this kind of work. What does it mean for you to be living in India, to do this work? How do you sit with that now? I mean, what's the importance of it for you, for your sense of self, who you are? We joked, but you are somebody who lives outside New Delhi. You have a farm. You're very invested in the culture and the history and the future of India as much as its past.
Well, as you know, Jerry, you don't write a book in a sense as an expression of your identity. You write a book as something you're interested in, and this seemed to me to be a fascinating whole world. I went about 10 years ago to the Ajanta caves, found a whole load of new frescoes which had just been cleaned, and that set me off on this early period of history. Again, I wrote a whole series of articles, and it emerged from that, going back, because previously I've been an 18th century historian for the last 20 years. And this took me back to this early period, which I was determined to have spent 5 years absorbing and travelling through and visiting Angkor Wat and these wonderful Buddhist sites in Borobudur in Indonesia and so on. That is really the reason that I wrote this book, because it's a fascinating world and that's what I wanted to study it. But yes, I mean, I have the privilege of having this double life. I've got a house in London and I rent a goat farm in India where I live most of the time. And I do straddle the two worlds in a way that people have often done, but usually it's coming the opposite direction these days. Normally it's Indians who've moved westwards rather than Brits who've moved eastwards. That was the old way. Now it's in reverse. We have the implosion of the empire, and many of the cleverest historians and writers of our generation are from India living here.
Yeah.
But it, as a historian, it undoubtedly has changed my entire perception of the world. When I first went to India, I, like everybody else, had very benign very benign ideas about the British Empire, which, my work has proven that my early ideas were completely wrong. And it's also possible to live in India and study this stuff and not be aware of how little people know this stuff. I've just started a book tour, and in the first 2 lectures, I asked people in Edinburgh and then in the Borders, when I was talking about how the numbers we use every day, the numerals, the numbers on our computers and on our cell phones are of Indian origin. I ask each time how many people in the audience know that, and there's always, out of 1,000 people, 2 Indians who stick their hand up. None of the Whiteys, none of the Goras know it at all, and it is connected with colonialism. Indians are aware that their culture is ancient, and no one really understands how ancient and sophisticated the civilization is. Whether they're going to enjoy being told about it by a whitey remains to be seen. And I travel to India to launch this book next month, so we will see.
Well, you have travelled and traversed the world. It's rather like the Jain map that we've been looking at. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you.
It's always fun to talk to you, Jerry.
William
Dalrymple. Get you now on my podcast.
Are we sure we can do a deal? Anyway, William Dalrymple, thank you for joining me on What's Your Map?
Thank you, Jerry. Next time in North Yorkshire.
Yes! Thank you so much for listening. I'm Jerry Brotton. This has been an Oculi Mundi Exploration. Oculi Mundi is the online home of the Sunderland Collection of antique maps and atlases. The series producer is Emily Uchida Finch, and it's a Whistledown production.